For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2142 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2142, a bill to improve the ability of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to interdict fentanyl, other synthetic opioids, and other narcotics and psychoactive substances that are illegally imported into the United States and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Barron, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as communities across my district and across our nation continue to deal with the crisis of opioid abuse and addiction, it is incomprehensible to imagine a synthetic drug up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. Fentanyl is a manufactured opioid which, in its illicit versions, has contributed to tens of thousands of deaths. This fact is especially concerning given that this drug can be ordered online and delivered via mail or express consignment couriers from places like China. Fentanyl is a highly potent in trace amounts, and this problem is exacerbated due to fentanyl being extremely difficult for our authorities to detect. That's why Congresswoman Tsongas and I introduced the INTERDICT Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation that provides U.S. Customs and Border Protection to the most effective chemical screening devices and scientific support to detect and intercept synthetic opioids before they can cause more harm. Mr. Speaker, the INTERDICT Act will ensure that CBP will have additional portable chemical screening devices available at ports of entry and mail and express consignment facilities, along with additional fixed chemical screening devices available in CBP laboratories. It also provides CBP with sufficient resources, personnel, and facilities, including scientists available at all hours, to interpret screening test results from the field and authorizes, based upon professional expertise, the appropriation of $9 million for hundreds of new screening devices, laboratory equipment, facilities, and personnel for support during all operational hours. Combined, the additional chemical screening devices, scientists, and other resources will help safeguard CBP field personnel from exposure to fentanyl and other deadly synthetic opioids and narcotics and prevent their unlawful importation. As an EMT and former federal drug prosecutor, I've seen firsthand the devastating impact of addiction in our communities and understand the increased danger added by synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Illicit fentanyl being trafficked into the United States poses a continued threat to the American people. By passing this legislation, this body can follow through on its promise to the American people and align our policy with the President's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis, which has prioritized regulating the flow of fentanyl in its interim report. I urge all of my bipartisan members of this House to join me in supporting this bill, and I reserve back the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2142, the INTERDICT Act of 2017, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2142, the International Narcotics Trafficking Emergency Response by Incoming Contraband with Technology Act, or the INTERDICT Act, is an important piece of legislation in our ongoing fight to stop the flow of illicit opioids like fentanyl from places like China and Mexico. According to the CDC, the death rate from synthetic opioids, which includes drugs such as tramadol and fentanyl, increased from 72.2% from 2014 to 2015. In 2016, CBP seized nearly 200 pounds of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, primarily from along the southwest border. This is a 25-fold increase over seizures from the previous year. The INTERDICT Act before us today ensures that CBP will have the necessary tools to better combat the flow of these opioids. More specifically, this bill provides CBP high-tech chemical screening devices to help detect and interdict fentanyl and other illicit synthetic opioids. Additionally, the bill provides for the laboratory equipment, facilities, and personnel for support during all operational hours. This bill was passed by our committee unanimously, and I commend the sponsors of this bill, Ms. Tsongas of Massachusetts and Mr. Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, for their leadership on this issue. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as she may consume to the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Tsongas.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for such time as she may consume.
And thank you to the gentlewoman from California for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2142, the INTERDICT Act, legislation I was pleased to introduce with Congressman Fitzpatrick. Whenever I meet with local public safety officials in my district, they explain the urgent need for resources and support to combat drugs like fentanyl. Be up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. In Massachusetts, the proportion of overdose deaths attributed to fentanyl is rising at a meteoric rate. At its lowest, in the third quarter of 2014, fentanyl was present in 18% of opioid-related deaths in Massachusetts. But by 2016, fentanyl was present in a staggering 69% of the state's opioid-related deaths, resulting in 1,400 fentanyl-related deaths in the Commonwealth, a staggering number. Although pharmaceutical fentanyl can be misused, most fentanyl deaths are linked to illicitly manufactured fentanyl and illicit versions of chemically similar compounds. The primary source of fentanyl is outside of the United States, in Mexico or China. The drug is smuggled in across the U.S. border or delivered via mail or express consignment couriers. The INTERDICT Act will provide U.S. Customs and Border Protection with the latest in chemical screening devices to deploy across the United States to better detect and intercept fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. Furthermore, this legislation will ensure that Customs and Border Protection has the resources, the personnel, and facilities, including scientists available during all operational hours, to interpret screening test results from the field. These high-tech devices will also protect law enforcement officers and their four-legged counterparts on the front lines from exposure to the deadly narcotic, which is so powerful that coming into contact with just a few grains can be fatal. I would like to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member of Homeland Security Committee for the Homeland Security Committee for their support. And I also want to thank Mr. Fitzpatrick for his partnership on this legislation, as well as our colleagues Senators Markey, Rubio, Brown, and Capito for their bipartisan work on the Senate counterpart legislation. The federal government must do its part to ensure our first responders have the tools they need in this greatest of public health fights. The INTERDICT Act provides important and powerful resources in this endeavor, and I urge its adoption. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I have no other speakers. If the gentlelady from California has no other speakers, I'm prepared to close once the gentlelady does.
Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I am prepared to close. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2142 is an important piece of legislation that has strong bipartisan support. Passage of this bill will go a long way in our fight against opioids. As such, I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 2142, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I once again urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2142, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question